Good afternoon, or evening, or morning, or whenever you happen to watch this video. I have been away from making videos for a couple of weeks because life is just too busy to keep on doing these things all the time, but I wanted to do a video about late antiquity, and maybe a few videos in a row about late antiquity, and of course, since this is supposed to be an ecclesiastical history channel, I will try to tie things back into the history of the church. But one of the things that is important if we want to do ecclesiastical history, the history of Christianity, the history of the church, whatever you wish to call it, properly, is that we have to tie it into its setting in the rest of the world. You have to put it into its wider historical thing. So, for example, right now, for Davenant Hall, I'm teaching a course on Christianity before Constantine. And last week on Monday, I had the great opportunity of giving a really, really fun lecture about the history of the Roman Empire from Augustus to Diocletian, sort of about 300 years of Roman history right there. And as a guy with training as a Roman historian, it was really fun to get into that stuff and show people photos of me with the Prima Porta Augustus or Constantine's big giant head. No, I didn't do that. Hugging the Tetrarchs in Venice, these sorts of things. And that's to help the students see what is this wider context in which the Christian theologians are writing, in which the martyrs are dying, in which Christians are just living and doing whatever it is that Christians do when they're neither writing theology nor being martyred, which is most of the time for most of the Christians, for most of history, including antiquity. So anyway, I've decided I really should do some videos about late antiquity. For one thing, unlike pirates, late antiquity is actually something I'm qualified to talk about. I suspect that is the reason why I don't often talk about it here. The more I learn, the more I realize how little I know. And so I sometimes feel a little bit like, I'm not qualified, even though I do have a PhD in this sort of thing. So maybe I am qualified, and maybe I should just bite the bullet and start making YouTube videos about late antique Christianity. Or just late antiquity at large. Who knows? So much excitement to be had. So, going to be talking about late antiquity. And one of the things that was sort of the catalyst to this, though, is I heard someone I know recently remark in an online forum that the later Roman Empire was a decaying society that nobody bought into anyway anymore, and that is the reason for its fall. But in fact, this isn't the case. One of the interesting things about late antiquity is the fact that everyone bought into the Roman culture, everyone bought into the Roman Empire, and they killed it off anyway. So I thought, let's set the record straight about late antiquity a little bit here. And so why not make some YouTube videos to that effect? So, late antiquity. What is late antiquity? When is late antiquity? Well, it's a fluid thing at either end. I tend to shoot for 235 on one end and 641 on the other. These are years AD. There's a whole other thing that we could say about why I say that. But anyway, but it is fluid. Peter Brown pushes it earlier to Marcus Aurelius, who died in the year 180. And his reasons for doing that are because he tries to find sort of these cultural moments, these cultural things that are sort of like common threads running through the entire period of late antiquity that tie people together from Marcus Aurelius to Muhammad. That's sort of, those are the end markers. That's the subtitle of one of his books even. And so then he says there's a certain kind of interiority and individualism. That's the wrong word. But there's an interiority that arises in the meditations of Marcus Aurelius that he believes characterizes the whole period. And so then this sort of cultural phenomenon, this social reality that is found in Marcus Aurelius, in Augustine of Hippo and Gregory of Nazianzus, their autobiographical works, not necessarily their theology, although Augustine's theology has a strong interiority to it. Anyway, these sorts of things, or Paulinus of Pella's Eucharisticon, we could go on, we won't. This is what characterizes late antiquity. And so, boom, we bring it to there. And then there's some other people who push it forward, who push the end later and later to, say, Charlemagne, maybe in the year 814, on the argument that there are other cultural factors that are part of the Roman world, part of Roman Empire, part of the culture of Europe and the Mediterranean that continue to persist through into sort of the heights of the Carolingian Renaissance and the Frankish kingdoms and empire. The difficulty, this is part of the difficulty of when we do things like called periodization, is that, well, how can you, there are no firm boundaries for this in actual fact. I have no doubt that if you think deeply about it and have read enough of the classical sources, you could probably find people before Marcus Aurelius who have this interiority that Peter Brown pinpoints in him. Or, on the other hand, you could find that, you will, in fact, find that the entire thing called the Middle Ages, which people say runs from 500 to 1500, that whole millennium, is basically one big reception of late antiquity, reading, rereading, reworking at every level. Medieval theology, gonna write commentaries on Dionysius the Areopagite the entire time, kind of thing. It is reading Augustine and Gregory in the West over and over again. If you read Gregory Palamas in the East in the 1400s, he is going back and recapitulating the Cappadocian Fathers from the 300s. So he's Gregory Palamas on Mount Athos is going into the depths of the theology of Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, as Basil of Caesarea in particular. So that's just theology. The poetry, the poetics of the medieval world are also in many ways late antique, even when this is a thing worth saying out there into the world. Even when a medieval poet is playing with classical things like Virgil, he's doing it in a way that has been cast in late antiquity by people who have produced the late antique jeweled style that Michael Roberts talks about, or people who are engaged in a lot of this, the metapoetics that Aaron Pelttari talks about in his book, The Space That Remains. And so medieval poetics is doing that. And they're all reading late antique poetry and engaging with it and producing their own stuff with that. So really, why would we stop with Charlemagne? Maybe late antiquity. Maybe we're still living in late antiquity. So given the difficulty then of saying, when does this cultural moment end? Because threads will continue to persist. You know, like, then I like to sort of look perhaps specifically or consciously think about late antiquity as from 235, which is the death of Severus Alexander, and the start of the 3rd century crisis that will persist for about 50 years until the accession of Diocletian, and runs to, say, 641, which is the death of Heraclius. And that is an important moment in antiquity as well, because the Emperor Heraclius, he has like this big war with Persia, and he has all these glorious things. They say, look at this! Heraclius is great. He's brought back the fragment of the true cross that the Persians had captured in battle, and he's restoring it to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Great triumphs for Christianity under Heraclius, and the Roman Empire is strong, beautiful, and great. Except that, of course, the Arab invasions happen during his reign. So Muhammad dies in 632, so the 641 date also encapsulates the rise of Islam, which completely transforms the geography, the political geography and religious shape of what today we consider the Middle East, right? And he goes and he conquers not he, because he's dead by then, but 636 is the siege of Jerusalem by the Arab armies. 635, before that, they had already taken Damascus, one of the chief cities of Syria. And then they conquer Persia over the course of the years 633 to 654. So that's a big deal, because Sasanian Persia is the other story. That is what is going on in late antiquity that we perhaps are not always as good at dealing with, because we don't always have access or knowledge or whatever. You can only know so many things. But my colleague Mark Humphries and Roger Collins have both, in separate, I think independently of each other, pointed out that we need to try to do this world history thing. As a researcher myself, they acknowledge, yeah, sure, you need to have your thing that you're the specialist on and focus on that. So I'm a specialist on papal letters in late antiquity and their transmission in the Middle Ages. So my PhD is on the works of Pope St. Leo the Great. That's fine. So that's what. But put Pope St. Leo the Great into this bigger, wider world. That's what Roger and Mark would say to do. And so, and in a really good paper that Roger Collins gave at the University of Edinburgh back when I worked there, Talking about their two eyes looking over the whole world, and one is meant to be the Roman emperor and one is the Persian emperor. And so there's this Persian resurgence in the 3rd century. You're probably, if you know Roman history but not late antique Roman history, you're probably saying, wait, Persians? Aren't they Parthians? And the answer is not anymore, bro. That's the story. So you have the Parthian Empire, right? Like the guys who are seen giving back Crassus's eagles on the Prima Porta Augustus on the breastplate. So those are the Parthians, and they are doing the Parthian thing. But there's a Persian resurgence that sort of takes over that part of the Near East in late antiquity, and the first major emperor of their dynasty, Khusro I, actually captures the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, which is a bit of a blow in the 250s. And so they're there until the same time that places like Jerusalem and Egypt are lost to the Romans. The Persians are there as their neighbors, and there's this sort of mutual respect, even though there's also often war, that this is the other great empire and the other ancient culture next door. And they're watching over the world side by side. They have all sorts of diplomatic things going on. And yeah, sometimes they're at war. They refer to each other as brother, though, right? Which is a traditional Near Eastern thing, that you treat a king whom you consider your equal, you call him brother. Whereas you do not do that to other kings who you consider your subordinates. So that's why, sort of very long-winded, I suppose, 641, it's still a Romano-centric date. I suppose we could say 654, final conquest of Sasanian Persia by the Arabs. But it brings us to this post-Muhammad moment, this last emperor of the Roman side of things before before or during the Arab invasions that dissolve much of what we think of in the Eastern Roman Empire. But of course, an ecclesiastical historian would say, but wait, no, if I'm just pure ecclesiastical history, how could I stop there? And this, of course, is endlessly the problem, because Heraclius gets in motion a bunch of theological things that don't find resolution until, let's say, 680, 681, the Sixth Ecumenical Council. So what about Maximus the Confessor, too? He's in Rome 645 to 653. What about him? The Lateran Council of 649. So yeah. Obviously, you say 641 is this ballpark thing, but if you're interested in some specific cultural questions, you can never just cut your period off. You can never say, like, I used to be a really tight late antiquity guy and be like, 476, boom, no more Western Empire. It's not the ancient world anymore. And in a way, I was right. Some of my friends who do early Frankish Merovingian type stuff were like, but there's more cultural continuity going on in my areas than between the 400s and blah, 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 right? Then not. And, I guess they're right? I mean, that's the problem with periodization. You're always going to find a year because you have to stop somewhere or start somewhere, right? It's like 17-year-olds who are well-informed are probably going to cast, quote, better votes than 40-year-olds who just don't give a rip, right? But you have to draw a line somewhere. 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, what's the big difference? Not a lot. Or how is a 19-year-old in Ontario a more responsible drinker than an 18-year-old in Ontario? Depends on the 19-year-old, doesn't it? So anyway, that's a long-winded thing as to why I chose those dates. I didn't realize it would take that long to talk about it, but I think it's an interesting question, because when we ask ourselves what is late antiquity, when we ask ourselves what is the later Roman Empire, and how we define that, it shows what priorities we're placing in the historical questions that we're going to ask. And so actually, I, as an ecclesiastical historian, perhaps 641, maybe I should push it farther because of the importance of Maximus and his companions. But then again, maybe I shouldn't. So that's just, boom. So that's sort of the period I'm going to be talking about. One of the dates that I have mentioned, I'll just close with this because I don't want to keep going too much longer. Just sort of introducing late antiquity here. The big thing, of course, that everyone talks about for late antiquity and the later Roman Empire, or we could call it the later Sasanian Empire, I don't know, the later Persian Empire, is the fall of Rome, right? At the beginning of late antiquity, there is a Roman Empire spanning the Mediterranean. At the end of it, there is a Roman Empire that's sort of well, it depends where you end it, but end it where I've ended it. That's sort of like Greece and the Balkans, Asia Minor, southern Italy, parts of North Africa. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that knowledge? How do we get there? The death of the Western Roman Empire. It's fallen 476. Is it a fall, though? What's Theodoric doing in a few years in the 480s? Is he not restoring proper Roman rule with the death of Odovaker, or however you want to pronounce his name? That's part of the fun, is when does Rome fall? And why does Rome fall? There have been over 200 explanations. That's one of the slides that people like to pop up onto the screen in their introductions to late antiquity courses at universities. There are over 200 explanations for why the Roman Empire fell. I think that ultimately it's a complicated thing because it's a complex society. But I do not believe that there's some sort of just general decline, or that people aren't buying into it or whatever. I think that there's an economic problem that is feeding a lot of things that feed into the suicide of the Roman Empire. And then there is a selfishness problem, which is possibly related to the economic one, which is to say the short-sighted self-interest of people of power and influence in Italy sort of screws it for everyone else. Every time in the 400s, as bits are slowly being eaten away, there's a possibility of having a big united front, or of paying some auxiliary troops. The super uber wealthy, we should call them the uber wealthy in Italy, aren't interested in backing that. And if you can't pay the troops, or if the curiales, the sort of lower upper class, can't afford to do all of the public services, who's going to be doing all the stuff, right? So why does Rome fall? Complicated, not a question I really feel like dealing with off the top of my head right now, because it's not one I've thought about for a long time. But the thing is, in the midst of Rome falling, all of these guys are coming in, they're taking Roman titles. So that's the reason why I do not believe in this idea that people aren't buying into the Roman system anymore. If they are, then why was Clovis the First, the king of the Franks, consul? Why was Theodoric holding his power in Italy with titles I forget what his titles were, but he had titles being given to him by the emperor in Constantinople? Why are they minting coins exactly the same but with kings' heads on them? Why are they in North Africa? Why are they doing everything, in fact, in North Africa as though they were Romans, just without Romans? So the culture of the later Roman Empire, the systems of the later Roman Empire, are being maintained to some degree by the new ruling class who emerges by the end of late antiquity, this sort of warrior class combined with some of the old Roman aristocrats. Depending where you live, there's a different mix of this sort of thing going on. But they're maintaining a large number of Roman traditions. They're still writing poetry. They're still like the 6th century in North Africa under the Vandals. People are still writing meaty, weighty theological texts, and they're still doing allegorical readings, Neoplatonic allegory about ancient myths. 2 different guys called Fulgentius. In fact, one is a theologian, one is a Neoplatonic mythographer. So yeah, they're buying into ancient classical culture in a big way. They're minting coins like Romans. Like I've said, they are keeping records, they are taxing, they are organizing their armies similarly to the way Romans were organizing their armies. They're building Roman-style stuff whenever they can. They're just doing any Roman traditions that they can maintain, they are maintaining. So people are buying into the Roman system at some level. They're just not buying into, what can we say? They don't have the literal money to buy into maintaining the actual superstructure of the Roman Empire. But they never actually thought it was going to come. They never thought that the fall of Rome was a thing. They never meant to kill it. And it never meant to commit suicide on its own. So this is the thing. Roman culture, Roman systems of organization and rule and bureaucracy, these are things that, where possible, continued through late antiquity and into the early Middle Ages. Good book on that is Chris Wickham, Framing the Early Middle Ages. That's like the big, fat, dense one. And then he has a more popular level one, The Inheritance of Rome, which goes up to the year 1000. But that's all I really wanted to say today, just to cast forth the things, not ecclesiastical history yet, But these are the parameters for the discussion to come. So I look forward to making a few more videos about late antiquity over the coming time. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.